Let's talk about the Whimsical Imagineer. Filmmaker Ken Kebow is here, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on the Tomorrow Society podcast, episode 27. I'm your host, Dan Heaton. One of the great things about the lower cost for equipment and digital video is that so many filmmakers have the ability to shoot documentaries about things they love. And that's definitely true about Disney World and about theme parks in general. Disney hasn't really gone out of their way to develop really great documentaries about the parks and even about Walt Disney. The things that are out there feel like there could be a lot more. So that's why it's always fun for me to see interesting, cool documentaries that delve into Disney history, whether it's about Walt and technology like Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, or whether it's about people that have gone to Orlando in order to get closer to the magic, like with Tony Cortese's documentary, The Disney Dreamfinders. There's so many good examples of documentaries that have come out or are coming out soon. And today's guest filmed his own documentary about Rolly Crump, which is called The Whimsical Imagineer. Ken Kebow filmed a 30-minute documentary with one of the great Imagineers, Rolly Crump, and I think it's one of those movies that Disney fans are going to love. It really gets to the heart about what made some of the Imagineers tick and what it was like for them to work under Walt Disney. And Crump worked on so many key attractions like the Tiki Room and It's a Small World and the Haunted Mansion. And it was really fun to get to talk to Ken about the experience of working directly with Rolly and putting together a film like this. So let's get to my conversation with Ken Kebow. All right, well, my guest today is Ken Kebow. He's a filmmaker, and he recently directed the documentary film The Whimsical Imagineer, who's about the legendary Rolly Crump. Ken, thanks so much for doing the podcast.
Dan, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for taking the time to look at the documentary and have me on your podcast. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. It's a really fun documentary, especially given the interviews with Rolly. So let's just talk about the documentary. So how did it get started? Where did the idea come from, and how did you get connected with Rolly?
Well, as Rolly would say, it's kind of a cute story. I've always been a fan of Disneyland, but I was having breakfast with my mom one morning, and she goes, "Hey, a friend of mine, Marie, is dating one of the guys that built Small World." And that was cool, but I really pictured a guy, back behind Small World, pounding nails in the flats, one of hundreds that probably worked on it. She goes, "Yeah, his name's Rolly Crump. You should check him out." And boy, I'll tell you, Dan, as soon as I Googled Rolly Crump and realized who he was and, what he had done at Disneyland, I was very excited because, again, being a Disney fan and just seeing what Rolly was able to do. And the beautiful thing, Dan, was once I met Rolly, boy, talk about a natural storyteller. He just, some people can tell stories and some can't. And once I sat down with Rolly before the project and asked him about it and discussed it with him, his memory is amazing. He tells stories very well. And honestly, it was just a pleasure and an honor to be the one to tell his story. And what he said, Dan, that really stuck with me, he goes, "You know what, Ken, I've got all these great stories that I know that I'm the only one that knows them. So, if I'm not able to tell them, they'll go away." So I think we did a pretty good job in between the DVD and the extras that you mentioned earlier before our podcast. There's a lot of great stuff in there that only Rolly knew about, and hopefully this will help get it to another generation of people.
Yeah, no, it's funny how things work because even like going through his life, there's so many kind of coincidences or decisions he made that fell into place where if he had made a different decision or something else, you just never know what would have happened. So the fact that I wouldn't say stumbled, but kind of stumbled upon one of the, especially in terms of people that are still alive, one of the legendary Imagineers that worked directly with Walt Disney, that's a really nice thing to happen, I'm sure.
I was very fortunate. Like I said, the more I found out about Rolly and spent time with Rolly, I mean, you said it perfectly, Dan. I mean, the people still with us that work directly with Walt, there's not a whole lot left. So, just a privilege. And I got to tell you, when we interviewed Rolly the first time, we interviewed him a couple times, but I had this, list of questions, a couple pages long. And I asked my first question. And honestly, Dan, about 5 hours later, we finished, and I don't think I asked another question. Rolly just hit every point, never mixed the thing, and just chronologically, there's a lot that didn't make the video because of time constraint, just went through, A to Z without a pause. It was the easiest interview I've ever done. It was great.
Yeah, well, he's definitely such a good storyteller, like you mentioned at the introduction, where you can tell why attractions like It's a Small World and the Tiki Room and other things he worked on, why those work so well now. Because that's the key. He's such a storyteller. But now my big question is, you said that you ask a question and he talked that long. Your film is about 30 minutes. How do you edit that into a cohesive film? Because that's got to be the big challenge, right?
Yeah, and anyone who's done documentary is you go in with a vision and an idea of what you're going to come out with, but you don't always end up with that. And I think this really worked to our favor because what I realized, Dan, we're trying to keep it under 40 minutes because that's usually the short documentary at film festivals. That's the cutoff. Is I realized that Rolly's individual stories were strong enough to stand alone. So rather than try and create this 30-minute narrative that never had any breaks or anything, once I started editing it, I go, God, each of these are 2 or 3 minutes. They have a great beginning, middle, and end, and Rolly tells them great. Throw in a couple more people that worked with Rolly and his son Chris, and suddenly every one of these, I thought, segments held together well. And it was kind of a different way to approach it. But once I sat back, after numerous cuts and, looking at a couple different ways, I go, Rolly's good enough and these things are interesting enough that I don't need to create this link between them. They each stand alone. So that was never the intention going in, kind of to have 7 or 8 individual stories, but it really worked well that way. And the way Rolly told the stories, when you watch it, or if you get a chance to watch again, you'll see he ends every story perfectly. You never have to there's very little voiceover in the show. And the only reason there is one voiceover that it's in there is because Rolly telling that story took too long. But he just, he made it so easy, beginning, middle, and end, and did it all with flair. So, and, I've got a lot of comments and compliments on the way it comes together. So I think, it just kind of worked out that way in the edit room, and we were very fortunate that way.
Well, that's interesting because I'm sure as a documentary filmmaker, there's plenty of times where you have to cut in video clips or other things or, shorten things not because people weren't interesting, but because they aren't able to kind of give an answer in a really succinct bite. But it sounds like it's not a surprise given what I know about him because he's really present. A lot of people, one of the reasons he worked on some of the most popular attractions, but he's really present still in the Disney community. So what do you think? What do you think it is about him that makes him so engaged? Because I know, there's there's others like Bob Gurr, who's also in your documentary that are equally that way. But there are others that worked on big things that aren't as comfortable. What is it about Rolly that makes him kind of get so, want to do a documentary like this?
Yeah, well, again, he had these stories that he wanted to get out there. And the other part of the set that I sent you has that nice walk in the park with Rolly, which, again, gives a lot of Disney stories that only Rolly knew. But besides this storytelling, and I get this a lot and hear this a lot from people, and Rolly, he tells it like it is. He doesn't candy coat anything. He tells it how he saw it and really doesn't hold any punches. If he thought someone, wasn't doing their part, he'll mention that. There's a couple swear words, just slight ones in the video, which I wouldn't normally leave, but they were just such a part of the story. I think people really like that Rolly's so original. The whole Tower of the Four Winds where Rolly said, Walt, he saw the final product, and I won't give away how it goes in the documentary, but he said, Walt, I think it's a piece of crap. And then he says, who else would tell Walt Disney that what they designed and built was a piece of crap, meaning him, Rolly. He cuts through all the BS, Dan, and I think people really appreciate that because it just kind of gets, I think, to the realism of Disney, and that, they're like anybody else and they have their struggles and things are tough. They come out continuously with amazing products, but they're all human and there's conflict and there's, problems and they're solved. And Rolly just doesn't shy away from that stuff and paint this, kind of, as my friends would say, butterflies and unicorn picture. He kind of gets a little bit more in the trenches. And I think he really tells it how it really happened. And I think people appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think that is what makes him more unique. I think you really hit on it. And also, I mean, from what I know about Walt Disney, he was constantly being in a company that's growing like this. You deal with a lot of people that aren't on the artistic side, that might be more middle management, that are trying to tell Walt what he wants to hear. I suspect that Rolly, because Rolly, was a fairly young guy compared to most of the people that worked there at the time.
Exactly.
And the fact that he was able to connect so much with Walt, I'm sure, I would guess, had something to do with the fact that he was willing to say something was a piece of crap, because I don't think Walt heard that too often.
You're spot on, Dan, and I've heard that Rolly say that more than once. Like a lot of powerful, successful people, Walt had a lot of yes men around him. However, what Rolly will point out is Walt never bought it. He knew when people were BSing him or bluffing him. And I think he really appreciated that Rolly just was very straight up and very straightforward with him. And I think that's why they had such a great relationship. These guys cannot say enough good about Walt Disney. They just, and I put a lot of believability and reality in that, because they worked with him day in and day out, instead of somebody who's, maybe making a short film or a book about Walt and, wants to bring up stuff that maybe wasn't true. They loved Walt and just worshiped the ground he walked on. But I think Walt really appreciated that Rolly didn't candy coat stuff. And I don't think he got a lot of that. Like you said, I think, a lot of these types of folks are surrounded by yes people. Everything's great. But Rolly, I think it's a piece of crap. He never shied away from what he thought was really the truth. And I think Walt ultimately really appreciated that about him.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to hear him talk about, you could sense it, he says some things, but his feelings about, I've heard him talk about other things, his feelings about the Haunted Mansion, that while he's often associated with that because he worked on it for years, he wasn't as close to the final product. So the sense I get, which is always a surprise because, even among fairly candid or honest fans of Disney and stuff, very few people go around just talking about how they don't think the Haunted Mansion is that great. It's generally considered kind of a classic. So it's interesting to hear a guy that was so close to it. He seems willing sometimes to just, you can sense that it's not his favorite thing because he feels like there were things he would have done differently.
Exactly. And the other great thing I like about Rolly is, in regards to the mansion, just to give you a little bit of background, we had a screening of the film last night at the Oceanside Film Festival, which we were lucky enough to win the top film the previous year. So they screened that. Rolly was there and took a Q&A. But the mansion came up. And the great thing about Rolly is he gave all the credit to Yale Gracie, who was a little bit more of the visionary, and he was working with Yale, but Yale really came up with a lot of the illusions. And I love that Rolly never takes credit for stuff he didn't do. He's very fair about saying who did what and, what their contribution was. But you're right, it's interesting. I think Rolly definitely has his favorite projects, and those were ones I think he was usually a little bit more embedded in and involved in, like A Small World, where he really was working with Mary Blair and making those major decisions that help shape the project. But I love that Rolly is able to always give credit where credit is due. And I don't know if that's always the case with very creative people, in that line of work.
Well, you mentioned The Small World, and, hearing him talk about The Small World and the fact that it was created basically in 9 months, and it was like he was starting from scratch. As somebody, he talks about how he led 30 people and he was basically told, okay, create the dolls and work with Mary Blair. What was it in his personality that helps it? Because it's not only that they finished, it's that they made something that really, with a few exceptions, like with characters, has mostly unchanged. What was it about him, do you think, that could get that done?
I'll speculate at a couple things. I talked to John Horney and Steve Kirk, as well as Chris and Bob Gurr, but Steve and John had worked under Rolly, and not a lot of this made it into the final film, but they just couldn't say enough good about Rolly's leadership and leading a creative team and how inspiring he was and all that. So I think that was part of it. I think Rolly's just a natural leader, and I think he gives his team a lot of creative leeway, and I think that's when people do their best work. I think the other thing, and again, a little speculation, Dan, but going kind of between the lines of the documentary, not necessarily said. But I think Walt had a great style of giving someone an assignment and then not micromanaging. He would say, okay, do this, and he'd stay involved. He'd check here and he'd check there. But you didn't have someone over your shoulder watching your every move. And I just think in between Rolly's ability to inspire creativity, and Mary Blair, of course, who's, just a legend in her own right, and then just Walt leaving people alone to do what they do best. At least my assumption from spending time with Rolly and doing the documentary, I think that had a lot to do with it. When someone's not checking on you all the time and you kind of curtailing your creativity, that's when the best work happens. And I think that was how Disney Land, originally, that's why it was so great, is everybody was allowed to do what they did best, and it shows.
Yeah, and I think he probably learned that approach partially. I know he brought a lot of his own stuff from the way, like you said, that Walt ran it, because Disneyland was built in a ridiculously short amount of time.
Yeah,
I mean, you hear now they do an overlay of an attraction and it takes 23 months. And I'm not just trying to pick on them, because it's not really apples to apples anymore.
No, but it's right. It's true. Yeah. But, you're spot on. It's and I talked to Chris Hump, Rolly's son, who had quite a bit to do with Shanghai, the latest park, as well as I think Tokyo and maybe even Paris. But yeah, it's and he'll be the first to tell you that the levels of management and approvals and this and that, of course, it's a different world and a different time, but that's not necessarily helping the project in a lot of ways. And I think just the freedom these original Imagineers had, I think that's a huge key to their success. I really do.
I agree. You can tell from hearing their stories and such. In a sense, Disney benefited from being smaller and a leaner company. And now that they got so successful and they're so big that it's really hard to function that way anymore, because there's so many levels, like you mentioned. And it's unfortunate, but it speaks to what they built. They built this huge company.
Yeah, it's a great company, and I've had a lot of dealings with them with this documentary and the footage and stuff. But I think Rolly kind of says it best at the end of this show, Dan, when he says, you know what? We didn't know what we were doing. Walt didn't know what he was doing. We just did it. And that was the mentality, is just, let's just throw our hats in the ring, give it our best shot and see what happens. And boy, they just nailed it. It's I think it's a great umbrella to work under, and I think people really do good work when they're not stifled by management or whatever, deadlines, whatever it may be. I mean, everybody's got those things, but I just think when those are a little bit more relaxed and not quite as dominating as it might be, sometimes people can really excel.
Right. And it's the story that Rolly talks about sculpting the tiki gods outside the tiki room, where he had never sculpted before. And those are timeless. Those are still there. It's crazy to me that he was able to even be given that job, and to have the trust in that is crazy.
That shows it right there. And he told a great story last night, Dan, that didn't make it into the video because of time, but the room he was sculpting in was so cold, it was a warehouse, that he couldn't get the clay, warm enough, soft enough to mold. So what he ultimately did is put everything on a big cart, went out to the parking lot, and did his tiki creation out in the middle of the parking lot, which he said was so funny because everyone thought he had this great studio with this beautiful northern light and all that. And there was Rolly out in the parking lot to warm up the clay to be able to make the tiki. So, it's just like you said, stories like that. And, okay, it's not working in the warehouse. I'm going out in the parking lot and getting my tikis done. Yeah, it's just timeless stuff. And I think you don't hear a lot of that anymore. I think, everyone's so accountable. And what company now would give a guy like Rolly with no experience in sculpting a chance to do that? They would say, oh, well, you have no experience. We can't do that. And that was the beauty of Walt, is he encouraged people to just run with it. And he kept his finger in it, made sure it was good. But he wasn't afraid to take chances and give people those opportunities.
Right. And if you hire the right people, like Rolly Crump or like Bob Gurr, who has very similar stories from when I've heard him talk, where it's basically, okay, go build this vehicle or something. But he hired people that had the skills. You can't just pick anyone and do that. I found it interesting, too, that on a related note, you talked about him just working in the parking lot, is when he got a job at Disney, glamorous job at the studio, he had to have a second job working weekends. Can you tell me a little bit about that story that comes up?
That's a great story. Rolly, as he mentions, always wanted to work at Disney, and he had that opportunity. And he wasn't going to take it because it wasn't, it was $35 a week. And his mom, thank goodness, had known he always wanted to work at Disney and talked him into it. And he says it great in the program. He goes, I was only making $35 a week. I was making that 2 days on the weekends, doing sewer manholes and laying cement away from Disney to make ends meet. But then he says, but there was a magic at the studio, and it was just an incredible place to work, and just the creativity and the freedom and the ability to learn just made it all worthwhile, because he wasn't making enough money there to make ends meet, so that's the weekends. But again, he saw the opportunity, and you made a point a little earlier, Dan, saying it's funny how serendipity just plays a part, and Rolly did say yes, and look what happened in between that and his propellers and all those other things that got him where he was. It was just such a magical place to work that the money came ultimately, but initially it wasn't important. It was worth the sacrifice, or having to work a weekend job to be able to stay there and just be a part of that magic.
I think when you find a job like that, it has to be just like enticing. I wouldn't say a drug, but like something that the draw is so strong. Yeah. There's nothing you wouldn't do for it. You can see how much it means to him. I was just going to say, you have the scene in the movie about him being listed as a Disney legend and him being given that window, and you can see how much it affects him even now, getting something, the guy who's gotten so many honors over the years, and to see that. Why do you think that in particular affected him so strongly?
You know what? I was really fortunate, and this was a lot of thanks to Rolly and Chris, that we were able to shoot at Disneyland for a couple hours before it opened one day. And seeing Rolly at Disneyland, I could just see him looking and taking it all in and remembering things. And I think just to be, there's so few windows there, as you know, and, that's the cream of the crop. And I think just Rolly's such a humble guy to know that he was considered part of that elite club, as is a legend. But, a window on Main Street, boy, it doesn't get much better than that. That really was whatever confirmation for Rolly that, he was part of that incredible group that made it all happen. So, he was very touched by that. And again, seeing him at the park that one day and just watching him reminisce. And at the end of the movie, as you've seen, he gets a little choked up talking about it. Yeah, it's very close to him and a very emotional experience for him and a huge part of his life. So, I think the window was just a culmination of, hey, you did a great job and we appreciate you type of thing.
Yeah, and you're right. It is a pretty small group of people, and the people that are up there are the legends. So I'm sure to be in that group is something. So tell me a little more about shooting at Disneyland. How were you able to get that set up, and how did it go? I know you shot in front of Small World, I think, and on Main Street. How did that go?
It went great. It was a great day. We didn't end up using a lot of the footage because the more stylized interviews that we did in front of the green screen, which is most of it, just tended to be a little bit better. But it was incredible. We got in, we worked with a wonderful woman there who basically takes film crews around, and we got in a couple of hours early. And, it's funny, Dan, I had this vision as, before I started the documentary, I go, God, I would just love to have a picture of Rolly walking alone down Main Street. And there is. At the very beginning, we have a shot of that. But it's so funny to work in that environment because there was music playing on Main Street, which there always is, regardless of whether it's open or not. And the woman whose name was Barbara asked me, is that music a problem? And, having done this for years and knowing that getting it turned off would probably be next to impossible, I said, it's not great, but we could live with it. And she gets on her walkie-talkie, and within, 2.5 seconds, the music on Main Street's down. And I'm just going, man, this is my kind of place. So it was a great experience. We got a chance to interview him in front of the mansion, Small World, like you said, in front of the castle, did some stuff on Main Street. A lot of that didn't make the final cut. But what was really cool, Dan, is we were there for about an hour after the park opened doing some shooting too. And I was amazed, not as much as I am now, but I was then at how many people recognized Rolly, how many guests. And it just confirmed, man, this guy, if you're a real Disney fan and really know the history, and just to recognize Rolly by face and his infamous glasses, it was very cool to see people come up to him with their picture taken, and he would just love that. So it was and it happened to be my 50th birthday just by chance when we shot there. So, I couldn't have thought a better way to spend it. It was really, really a fun day.
Oh, I can imagine. And yeah, especially at Disneyland, I think the people that I notice it, I haven't been to Disneyland as much as Disney World, but when I went there most recently. You just get the sense the people there, because there are a lot of locals and people that have grew up in California, some that have going to the parks for decades or longer, they know the park and they know the history. Rolly, I'm not saying he wouldn't be recognized at Disney World, but I think a lot of it was Disneyland, because for me, if I wouldn't recognize every Imagineer, especially a lot of the ones now. But if it was Rolly Crump, or there's a few like Tony Baxter and a few others, where if I saw them, I would be so starstruck. It would be almost like meeting Walt Disney. So
yeah. It was great. And that's kind of how it felt. You can see someone would come up to him and they'd just kind of be, glazed over in the eyes and shaking his hand. And Rolly's so great, he'd always take a picture and stuff. But that just kind of confirmed that, wow, because I'm a Disney fan, but I won't say as hardcore as some of them. Man, this guy, people know him and love him. And, it's a real thrill to meet him. It was a really fun day. And I think that was the last time Rolly was at the park. I think he really enjoyed it. I think he had a good time.
Well, great. You talked about how you went and you spoke to him the first time and you had, for a bunch of hours and then at Disneyland. How much did you end up shooting? Was that it? Or how many times did you talk to him?
Boy, we decided to just make it about Disneyland. As you probably know, Dan, Rolly did work at Knott's Berry Farm, a lot of independent work. He worked with the Cousteaus, Jacques Cousteau and his group. He worked with Barnum and Bailey, did a lot in Vegas early in his career with Steve Wynn when Wynn owned some of the downtown hotels. So I've got hours and hours and hours of non-Disney Rolly stuff that hopefully someday may see the light of day. So there's a lot there we weren't able to use. Some of it made it into the outtakes on the video, but, we're a little bit limited by the amount of space on a DVD with that as well. But Rolly's just got some great stories that have nothing to do with Disney. We just had to make a decision. I thought it kind of went a little too all over the place if we didn't concentrate on just the Disney stuff. But I've got a lot of great stuff that hopefully if the demand's there and the interest is there, I'd love to create another program, maybe talking about Rolly's non-Disney projects, because the stories and what he did are just as fascinating as what he did at Disneyland.
Yeah, I think you would almost have to do, total, not probably just for that, but you would have to have done like a feature-length documentary or at least an hour or so to do both. Because I did see the shot in the movie where you the camera pans over and sees a bunch of his business cards from other work he's done. There are certain people, I wouldn't name myself, but the Knott's Berry Tales ride that he worked on at Knott's Berry Farm, people are so into that. So just something like that. And even like you mentioned with the Cousteaus and some of his Vegas work, it's like he had an entirely, it wasn't like linear, because I know he came back and did some work on Epcot, but it's almost like he had a second career beyond Disneyland that's and it's kind of crazy. So that would fascinate me, and I wouldn't even say I know as much about it as some people, but I would find, especially the way he can tell a story, I can't imagine that wouldn't be thrilling.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. And just as a little teaser, he I think it was the Frontier Hotel in downtown Vegas, which I think is still standing, but that was one of Steve Wynn's first hotels before he was, the guy he is now in Vegas. And Rolly was responsible for, I guess, each floor on the elevator had a different Western ghost town theme. And I think Rolly was responsible for the wallpaper or the drawing you'd see getting off the elevator on each floor of Tombstone or Dodge City, of all that. There's all these, it's just great stories, and I'm sure that those are long gone, but just like you say, his non-Disney stuff is just a whole other huge chapter in his life. And again, with Rolly's talent for storytelling, it's great stuff. It's really fun. He's done a lot of really cool stuff in his life.
Yeah, and speaking of his artwork or what he's able to do in terms of theming, I have to mention the Museum of the Weird section, which is another area where it fascinates people to this day. And even the shots you have, both I think in the movie and then in the extra footage on the DVD, some of the shots are crazy, like the Candleman and the chair and all of those things. So from your perspective, why do you think this connects with people so much more? Because I think of everything he's done beyond the Tiki Room, It's a Small World, everything else, this seems to jump out more than anything. From your perspective after talking with him, what is it about this that attracts people so much?
Well, I think a lot of it may be that it was never realized. What happened is Walt died a certain amount of time after he had said, let's do this. So it never, came to fruition. I think it's one of those things, Dan, like, you see the pictures and you see Rolly's drawings, and there's kind of this folklore about it. So there's almost this speculation that why did it never happen? It was interesting yesterday at the screening, someone asked that they had heard that someone was going to create a virtual reality of the Museum of the Weird, kind of as a, to finally make it happen. And Rolly just laughed and said, I haven't heard anything about that. But I think that the work is there, and knowing Rolly's ability and his, just creativity, that it's one, it's almost like the, what's the Indiana Jones of the cup that everybody drinks from, the Holy Grail.
Holy Grail, yeah.
Everybody knows it's there. It has all this mystery surrounding it, and you see pictures and you see Rolly and you see drawings, but it never came around. So I think there's a certain mystery attached to it. And, when you look at what he was doing for it, I mean, it would have been the coolest thing. And Rolly did say in one of the interviews that the plan was that Rolly was going to literally travel the world and find these just crazy things, that he would put in the Museum of the Weird. That was the plan. So it would have been just incredible to walk through that at the end of the Haunted Mansion. But again, ultimately, Walt passed away and the idea went away with him. But I think people just saw what could have been the Museum of the Weird, and I'm the same way. I would love to see someday something realized. Just such a great idea, and again, with Rolly at the helm, it would have just been amazing.
Right, and I think you bring up a good point about, part of it is how crazy and interesting it is and everything, but also the fact that it wasn't made is that. Yeah. I think that's the key, and that doesn't dismiss what it was. It's just there's other attractions like that where you hear stories and you think, wow, I can't imagine what that would be. And you just hope that if they made it, you would hope, I think if Rolly was involved, it would have been closer to what we expect rather than falling short.
Yes.
So you mentioned also that I saw, in the movie, there's clips of, Rolly's son or Bob Gurr and Steve Kirk and others. How were you able to connect with that group? I know they're have a limited time in the movie, but I think their presence is good.
It is, yeah, and that was all from a list from Rolly. Chris obviously was fairly available because he's, he was still an Imagineer at the time and just up in L.A. But I found out that John was up in L.A. as well, and Steve was literally about a half hour from where I live. There were quite a few other names on the list, but a lot I couldn't reach. I tried. Some were, at the East Coast. We didn't have a huge budget to travel with this. And you know what? Ultimately, Dan, I love the extra interviews in there, but Rolly told the story best. And I didn't see a need to have, like a lot of documentaries, 7, 8, 9 other people talking about Rolly, because the guys that are in there did a great job and filled in some nice gaps that Rolly maybe didn't talk about. But ultimately, when I watched the footage, Rolly told the story better than anybody. So I go, these guys, Steve and John and Bob and Chris add great stuff to what Rolly has said. But other than that, Rolly really tells it best. So I didn't feel a reason, like a lot of documentaries I've worked on and other ones you've seen, to get a lot of different people. To me, it just would have muddied the waters and really meant less time of Rolly on the screen. So it worked out pretty well. And those guys were great. They, were the ones working with Rolly. And of course, Chris was a son and Bob was an equal. And John and Steve worked under/with Rolly. So I think we got a couple good perspectives without overdoing it.
No, I agree. I think what they provide is helpful, but you're right. This is different than a case where, a lot of times you'll have documentaries the person isn't still alive. So you need to have all these perspectives or use archival footage or whatnot. But in this case, because you do have the guy, it makes sense, and he's got such good stories. So on that note, though, we've talked about on the DVD, there's a lot of extra footage and all of that. Sticking to the finished work, what was some of the things that were the hardest for you to end up leaving out? Like the last things you cut just to kind of, you felt like they didn't fit?
Yeah, if you look at the extras, which I think you mentioned you did, Dan, that's a lot of them. Rolly tells this great story that I originally had in the ending credits about the psychic that he went to see when a lot wasn't happening at Disney. And I don't want to ruin the story for people who might want to get the DVD, but basically going to a psychic and getting a really interesting reading from her about things hanging from the ceiling and a bunch of people working for him. And this one, he was basically doing nothing much at Disney or at WED. So I think most of the stuff that was really good, a lot of it's in the outtakes. It just didn't lend itself. There was a lot more about his relationship with Walt, and the walk in the park that's included in the set with the DVD touches on a lot more of that. It got to the point, and Rolly's such a good storyteller that a lot of times A, B, and C, then you get to D, and you've got to go back to A, B, and C to understand D. And we just, again, like you said, a feature-length documentary, 90 minutes or so, we could have done that. But, when you start editing this stuff, it's like writing. If you don't have a good preface for someone or a project or a date or something like that you were talking about earlier, that little piece doesn't make sense. So I'm kind of getting off track here with your question. But I think a lot of them are in the outtakes because, again, that was pretty much unlimited besides the room on the DVD. And, just the embellishments. There's a great story someone asked Rolly to tell at the screening yesterday that you probably know, Dan, because it's in his books about the janitors in the Haunted Mansion when he and Yale were working on that. That was a great story. But again, in the context of the time we had and kind of how we structured it into 2 or 3 minute pieces, it wasn't a good fit. But it's a great story. And if someone hasn't heard it, I encourage them to read the book because it's just a hilarious story. I hate not to use it because Rolly telling it makes it even better. But there's a lot of those things in the outtakes as well as it, just didn't make the disc. But again, I think what it is, Dan, is putting anything like that into Rolly's hands. He's just so good at telling stories that everything kind of comes to life.
Yeah, and I don't mean to focus too much on the outtakes because I think the movie itself comes together really well. So I feel like I've been asking you lots of questions about what wasn't in it, but what was in it was very good. So I just want to make that clear.
It kills me. The outtakes, like I said, I wanted that psychic story over the credits, but it was about 3 minutes and the credits are short. We wanted to keep it under 30. But no, some of the best stuff is in the outtakes. It just didn't have a good fit. So no, I'm right there with you. That stuff's really fun.
Well, excellent. So I want to close out. I want to ask a few questions about you. So I know you mentioned you're not like a diehard Disney fan, but tell me a little bit about, you had to be interested enough to want to do the film. So what is your background with Disney, or like, did you go as a kid, or you lived close to Disneyland at the time, or kind of how did it connect with you?
I grew up in Southern California, so I spent a lot of time there, Dan, as a youngster, and always loved probably the Haunted Mansion more than anything else. So, I'd go to Disneyland and make my own Haunted Mansion back at home with my friends and, silly ghost gags and stuff like that. So I'm probably a little bit more of a Disney fan maybe than I let on earlier. But I've always just loved the place. And the movies, especially the animated movies, have always had a place in my heart, like most people my age. I think the coolest thing about it, though, Dan, is, I still go back fairly regularly because I've got kids and grandkids. And it's always a great experience. It's always a different experience when you're 10, 20, 30, 40, but it's always a great experience. And I mean, how many places in your life can you really say that when you go back 20 years later as more of an adult that it still has that magic and charm? Boy, besides Disneyland, I'm a little hard-pressed, to name too many places. And I think that's the magic of it. So, yeah, I went a lot, enjoyed it a lot, mimicked it a lot in my own little, rides after the fact, and probably enjoyed it and had more of an impact on my life than I let on in the first place. But I've always been a huge fan of the park. I've been to Disney World once and enjoyed it very much. But, yeah, my heart belongs to Disneyland, I think.
Well, that makes sense, especially given where you grew up. I'm here in Missouri, so I spent more time at Disney World just because you could drive there a lot easier and such. Yeah. But I even know what you mean there about how, I went there as a kid, as like a teenager, and now I have kids. They're fairly young, but even the difference between my 4-year-old and my 8-year-old and how they see the park and how I see it, it's amazing to me how it's changed, and there's different things, and there's, everything. But the feeling you have there, and I'm sure that's what you're talking about with Disneyland, it's still there across generations. And yeah, I can't name too many things that match up with that. So I'm a little jealous that you got to spend so much time at Disneyland, though, because that park is really special.
And for you and me, I think now it's so cool to take your kids, and it's so cool to take your grandkids. And, the thing is, there's still a lot of the original stuff there. I won't say a lot, but, at least original as when I was a kid in the 60s, So you feel like even 50 years later when you go back, there's still a lot of that stuff that just fascinated and thrilled you as a kid. And as you know, as a dad, the thrill to, expose your kids to that is just, to see their faces and how much they enjoy it. That's the payoff right there. It's really fun that way.
No, I agree. And you mentioned the Haunted Mansion. What are some of the other attractions you really like to do when you do get to Disneyland?
Yeah, you know what, Dan? I'm a huge fan of the dark rides. And for people who are not familiar, those are most of the ones in Fantasyland. But, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, Snow White, Peter Pan. I have always really liked those rides and try to go on them when I go back. Big fan of the Pirates. Rolly didn't have much to do with the Pirates, but I really like the Pirates. But I do have to tell you, since working with Rolly and getting to know Rolly, I have so much more of an appreciation of Small World than I ever did. And I kind of feel like I've almost had a renaissance or reawakening with Small World, because for years I just didn't make it a point to go there. And now knowing about Rolly, the history, how involved he was, and more about it, it's right there at the top of the list now. So Rolly's given me much more of a appreciation of Small World than I probably have ever had in my life. Yeah, there's and I'm excited about the new stuff they're doing. The stuff with Star Wars is going to be great. The park changes and stuff comes and stuff goes, but when it's in Disney hands, it always seems to turn out okay. So I'm glad they're evolving and changing things, and sure, some stuff goes away, but they've done a good job of holding on to the staples. And I think there'd be quite a backlash if they ever close the Tiki Room or ever close Small World. Some of these older things. I don't think people would stand for it. And I think Disney knows that, so they leave them alone. We both know the Tiki Room is very old and hasn't been updated, but it's still great to sit in there and sing along with that crazy song. It's just a tradition. It's a part of Disneyland. So hopefully they'll never get rid of that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, and I think you're lucky. In California, they do, I think because it's such a locals-centered park in terms of how many people go there, that they're less likely. I know they've made some changes, but like with those Fantasyland dark rides, I mean, you go there and there's Mr. Toad and Snow White and things that are not still in Florida, or ones that were never there, like Alice in Wonderland and Pinocchio and such. So it's cool. Yeah, I think your Tiki is safe. They did put a different version in Florida for a while, and then they had a fire and they put back the original. And I don't think too many people are yearning for the one that replaced it. So I think you're safe.
I'm laughing, Dan, because there's a story that didn't make the cut about Rolly's experience helping with the Disney World Tiki Room. And let's just say he's probably pretty happy it's not real popular as well. Not one of his best experiences, he said. But we won't get into that. But there's some really fun stuff. That never disparaging anybody. But just, here's a guy that worked on the original that people love. And, maybe we don't need to mix it up and make it different. So,
yeah, no, that makes sense. So what other documentaries or what other types of projects do you usually work on?
Well, I do a lot of corporate video because that pays the bills, and enjoy that work. A lot out here in San Diego, a lot of biomedical, a lot of golf stuff. A lot of those companies are out here. Actually now doing a lot of military and police training, which I really enjoy. As far as documentaries, we did a really good one that I'm just starting to rework a couple years ago called Lincoln's Greatest Speech. Was able to work with a gentleman who's a Lincoln scholar who wrote a great book on Lincoln. We were fortunate enough to get Richard Dreyfuss to perform the speech. So kind of reworking that. It got lost in the shuffle a little bit of being too busy. So I'm a huge history buff. So that's really cool. And of course, working with Mr. Dreyfuss was great. So I tend to lean more towards historical stuff like that, or Rolly, which I consider historical. And these are all kind of pet passion projects, Dan. The corporate stuff pays the bill, but every couple of years I get a little itch to do something off the beaten track. And, the Disney project's funny. That was about 8 years in the making, about 2 years of production. And I have nothing bad to say about Disney Legal. They came through and have been great to deal with. But about the other 6 years was getting permission to use the stills in the film. It's they're passion projects. You just got to go with the flow. They never get finished quickly, but hopefully they get finished and people enjoy them. And the feedback and comments we've got on Rollies, it's just so nice, like yesterday, people to just come up and say, what a great story. And it just warms my heart. And I love this attraction or that attraction. And I think we've been very fortunate. We've made a film that really connects with people and is very emotional, because you watch Rolly talk about these things. And anyone who's ever been to Disneyland, there's something in this film they could connect with. And that credit all goes to Rolly. He on screen, he just makes it happen. And it's been a great experience. Definitely probably the high point of my professional career has been doing this with Rolly. It's been great.
Well, great. Yeah. And as somebody who's doing a podcast right now, that is not my full-time job. I can definitely understand the passion projects versus doing the corporate videos. But the Lincoln thing sounds very interesting. I mean, Richard Dreyfuss is a very talented actor. And actually, there's a Disney connection even because of great moments with Mr. Lincoln. So I wouldn't be surprised, especially as you work this up, that given the fact that now so many have seen your documentary about Rolly Crump that there might even be more interest, where it would interest me anyway, and so many are interested in Lincoln as it is. But that's definitely something that I think a lot of people, Disney fan or not, might be interested in.
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, I think it's a good show. Like I said, we're kind of reworking it. But much to my family's dismay, when I go to Disneyland, I still want to go see Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, which I'm glad they reopened. And I'm, of course, all by myself doing it. And they're off doing something else. But I don't care. It's great. There's a real funny Dreyfuss story. He worked on some Disney project years ago that he mentioned to me was one of the best projects he ever worked on and never got released. And I don't know more about it than that, but he said it was incredible, and somehow the whole production got held up by some legal thing or something. And you just got to wonder what happened to that, if it's still sitting on a shelf somewhere. But for Richard Dreyfuss to say that was one of the best things I ever worked on, and knowing that it was never seen by anyone, boy, that's kind of like the Museum of the Weird. You want to start digging around a little bit and find out what's going on there. So, who knows? Maybe someday someone will clean the shelves in the Disney archive and discover that, and we'll get to see what he's talking about.
Yeah, there's probably Disney and others. I suspect there are a lot of different stories of things in the vault, of things actors and others worked on like that.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to think about. Who knows? It could be almost anything given the company's history. Well, this was really fun. I really appreciate you talking to me and love the documentary. So if listeners want to learn more about the Whimsical Imagineer or purchase a copy, where's the best place they should go online?
Well, thanks, Dan, and I want to thank you. This has been really fun, and your questions were great, and I've really enjoyed myself. Thanks for having me. They go to rollycrump.com, and we've got a web page, and they can preview the program, and they could purchase it there through PayPal. And we just started selling a couple months ago. It's been doing really well. People really seem to enjoy it. And the nice thing about it, it comes with the DVD of the half-hour show as well as the extras you and I have talked about. But we also have a CD in there, a little bit of old school, but we figured that's the best way to package it with what's called a walk in the park with Rolly. And Rolly used to do these walks actually at Disneyland quite a few years ago, where he'd get a group of people and walk around. And the cool thing about the walk in the park is, boy, there's a bunch of stuff there that you probably would never realize, and there's nothing better than listening to that and then going to the park, because then you could see this tree and see that wall and see where Rolly made this. So, yeah, people have really seemed to enjoy it. And I think, for me, Dan, it's been great to, like I said, the first thing Rolly said was, I've got all these stories, and when I'm gone, they're gone. So I feel really good that now we've got a bit of an archive about Rolly and his stories that hopefully could live on for years. And I think by knowing these stories and hearing these stories, I think it just makes you appreciate Rolly and Walt and Disneyland that much more. But rollycrump.com, and everything's right there.
Well, excellent. I would highly recommend it as somebody who, is interested in the history and knows a little bit about him. But even if you know a lot or a little, there's going to be something that'll surprise you. And Ken, thanks again for being on the podcast.
Hey, I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for taking the time. It was great, and I hope we get a chance to chat again sometime soon.
Definitely. Well, it was really cool to talk to Ken about the Whimsical Imagineer and working with Rolly. I'd highly recommend that you check out the documentary, which came together really well and should be fun for anyone who's interested in Disney history. If you'd like to learn more about what I'm doing, you can always go to tomorrowsociety.com, or you can follow me on Twitter, TomorrowSOC, Facebook at Tomorrow Society, and Instagram at Tomorrow Society. You can also reach out to me by email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. I love to hear from you guys. It's always fun to get feedback about the show, and you can also do that with a rating or review at iTunes. If you'd like to subscribe there, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com/subscribe. Another way to support the show is through Amazon. If you go to tomorrowsociety.com/Amazon, any purchases you make will help to support the show. It's been so much fun to do these recent episodes, and I just want to keep doing more and finding new ways to explore what's going on with theme parks and their history. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again very soon.